All right, today we are going to start chapter 6, which is the chapter on the road to revolution. And in chapter 6, we're going to take a look at the different events that pushed Great Britain and the American colonies apart and ultimately led to the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So we'll look at tighter British control. We'll take a look at how the resistance in the colonies grew, and then we'll talk about the road to Lexington and Concord, a famous first battle of the Revolutionary War. And then we finish with how the United States, the American colonies declared independence. But today, we're going to talk about tighter British control. And I'm going to tell you a story right here about this man in this picture, James Otis Jr. He was a young Massachusetts lawyer that stormed through the streets of Boston one day in 1760, and he was absolutely irate, furious mad. His father had just been denied the post of Chief Justice of the Massachusetts colony by the royal governor. So to Otis, this is one more example of Britain's lack of respect for colonial rights. Another example was its use of search warrants that allowed customs officers to enter any home or business to look for smuggled goods. Otis thought these searches were illegal. So he took up a case against the government that involved these search warrants, and in court in February of 1761, Otis spoke with great emotion for 5 hours about the search warrant and its use, and he said, "It appears to me the worst instrument of arbitrary power, the most destructive of English liberty and the fundamental principles of law that was ever found in an English law book." And that's James Otis Jr. speaking in a book called James Otis, the Pre-Revolutionist. So spectators listened in amazement, and one of them, a young lawyer named John Adams, later wrote of Otis's performance, "Then and there in the old council chamber, the child Independence was born." In making the first public speech demanding English liberties for the colonists, James Otis planted a seed of freedom. In this section, we'll talk a little bit more about the early protests against Britain's policies in America. So by the end of this section today, you should be able to identify why the Proclamation of 1763 angered so many colonists. You should also be able to describe the debate over taxes and troops in the colonies. You should be able to explain the Stamp Act, and you should be able to examine how the colonists forced Britain to repeal the Stamp Act. So moving on. Now, during the French and Indian War, Britain and the colonies fought side by side. Americans took great pride in being partners in victory over the French. However, when the war ended, some different problems came up. Britain wanted to govern its 13 original colonies and the territories gained in the war in a uniform way. They wanted things to be the same. So the British Parliament in London imposed new laws and restrictions. Now, before this, the colonies had been allowed to develop largely on their own, and now they felt their freedom was being limited. The first of Parliament's laws was the Proclamation of 1763, and it said that colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Britain wanted this land to remain in the hands of its Native American allies to prevent another battle like they had with Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, this made the colonists very, very angry because they had hoped to move to the fertile Ohio River Valley, and a lot of these colonists had no land of their own, and it also upset a lot of colonists who had actually bought land there as an investment. So as a result, a lot of people ignored this law, and you can see right along this area right here, this is the Proclamation line west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, a lot of colonists, they wanted to settle down in here because this is really good farmland, very fertile area to farm and grow crops. Moving along, King George III, the man here you see on the left, he was the British king, the monarch, and he wanted to enforce the proclamation and also keep peace with Britain's Native American allies. Now, in order to do this, he decided to keep 10,000 soldiers in the colonies. In 1765, Parliament passed something called the Quartering Act, and this was a cost-saving measure that required the colonies to quarter or house British soldiers and provide them with supplies. General Thomas Gage, which was commander of these forces, put most of these troops in New York. Now, Britain owed a very large debt from the French and Indian War. War is expensive, it costs money, so they had to pay that debt somehow. So keeping troops in the colonies would raise that debt even higher, so Britain needed more revenue. Revenue is a fancy term for income. The reason we needed our income is we needed to meet our expenses. So it attempted to have the colonies pay part of the war debt, and it also wanted them to contribute toward the costs of frontier defense and colonial government. In the past, the king had asked the colonial assemblies to pass taxes to support military actions that took place in the colonies, but this time, however, Parliament voted to tax the Americans directly. Obviously, this makes the Americans very upset. Right here you can see this is actually the Parliament chambers This is a current day picture, but back in the 1700s, this is the same room where the Parliament met to discuss lots of issues pertaining to the colonies. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which was a law that placed a tax on sugar, molasses, and other products that were shipped into the colonies. They also called for strict enforcement of the act and harsh punishment of smugglers, people who brought in goods illegally. Colonial merchants who often traded in smuggled goods reacted with anger. One colonial leader, James Otis, we talked about before, he claimed that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies since the colonists were not represented in Parliament. As Otis exclaimed, taxation without representation is tyranny. In response, the British Finance Minister George Grenville, he disagreed, and he said the colonists, they're subjects of Britain, they're citizens, so they enjoy the protection of our laws, and for that reason they are subject to taxation. In 1765, Parliament passed other acts. It wasn't just the Sugar Act that came along, but in 1765, they passed the Stamp Act, and this law required all legal and commercial documents to carry an official stamp that showed that the tax had been paid. That's kind of like the stamps we pay in postage nowadays, which I don't even know what postage is, probably like 44 cents or something like that. But anytime we ship something through the mail, we pay a postage, and so we're used to that. But this hit the colonists very hard because this law required all legal and commercial documents to carry an official stamp that showed that things had been paid. So all diplomas, contracts, wills, they had to carry a stamp. Published materials like newspapers, they had to be written on special stamped paper. So this act was a new kind of tax for the colonies, and the Sugar Act was just a tax on imported goods. It affected mostly merchants only. But in contrast, the Stamp Act was a tax that was applied within the colonies, and it fell on all the colonists, not just the merchants. So even more of a problem was that the colonists had to pay for these stamps in silver coin, which was an item that was pretty scarce in the colonies. Now this picture here, this is the colonial view of the hated stamp tax, and it's shown by a skull and a crossbones and this emblem above. So they were definitely not in favor of this. This is what they called the fatal stamp. They thought this was going to kill the colonies. Now, it didn't take long for the colonial leaders to start protesting this. For them, the issue was pretty clear. They were being taxed without their consent by a parliament in which they had no voice. If Britain could pass a Stamp Act, a lot of them thought, what other taxes might they pass in the future? Samuel Adams, he was a leader in the Massachusetts legislature, he asked, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands, and in short, everything we possess and make use of? Which nowadays we pretty much do tax everything. So Samuel Adams was right, and they were afraid of these taxes. So this guy here on the left, Patrick Henry, he was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses. He called for resistance to the tax, and when another member shouted that resistance was treason, Henry replied, if this is treason, let's make the most of it. So they were ready to go all in. So like we said, this was, no taxation without representation became a very common cry among the colonists, which you can see here in this picture. And in this picture right here, we're seeing it took place in October of 1765. 9 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to what is called the Stamp Act Congress in New York City. And this was the first time the colonies met to consider acting together in protest. So there were delegates from 9 colonies. They drew up a petition to the king protesting the Stamp Act, and the petition declared that the right to tax the colonies belonged to the colonial assemblies, not to Parliament. So later, these guys got together, or the colonial merchants got together, and they organized a boycott of British goods. And by definition, a boycott is just a refusal to buy. At the same time, some colonists formed secret societies to oppose British policies, and the most famous of these groups by far were the Sons of Liberty, and they were based out of Boston. A lot of the Sons of Liberty were lawyers, merchants, and craftspeople. We had some very famous Americans that were part of the Sons of Liberty, which we'll get into in the next couple sections and chapters. And they weren't always peaceful. They did protest quite frequently against the British and their policies. So whenever they could get their hands on stamped paper, they would burn it. They also attacked customs officials. Customs officials were guys that would collect taxes. So they're just doing their job. But when they were out and about, the Sons of Liberty would find them. They would attack them. They would cover them with hot tar and feathers, and they would parade them around in public. They would, like in this picture here, they would pour hot tea down their throat. What you're seeing here is a very famous political cartoon. You can see the men in the picture kind of look like witches. They have long pointy noses, and this was a picture of that was run in British papers. And you can see also then the background, they're dumping tea in the bay, and there's a noose hanging off of the tree saying that these guys are hanging themselves. And so it's, the Sons of Liberty were not a group of people that were very well liked by British officials at all. Now, at the same time that they were, going around and attacking customs officials and protesting, these protests did start to have an effect in Britain. There were a lot of merchants that thought their trade with America would be hurt. There were actually some British political leaders, like William Pitt. He agreed with the American thinking, and he spoke out against the Stamp Act. And then finally in 1766, Parliament did repeal the Stamp Act. They viewed it as a mistake, so they got rid of it. But at the same time, Parliament passed something called the Declaratory Act, which gave Parliament supreme authority to govern the colonies. So Americans did celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act. They did try to ignore the Declaratory Act. So there's a pretty big struggle and tug of war going on between Parliament and the colonies. And the main issue here was control of the colonies, which we'll talk about in our next section. So.